A lot of these pharmacies, they're not really pharmacies. They are basically unapproved drug sellers. They're not compounding pharmacies.
Just because this is such a huge market potential, with there's so many people who are out there looking for these weight loss drugs, that's when the bad actors tend to come out of the woodwork.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Healthcare Strategies. I'm Olivia Kaler, Senior Editor of Pharma Life Sciences. Today, we are unpacking the rise of GLP-1 medications that have reshaped diabetes and weight loss management treatments, while creating ripples in the online healthcare market. Joining me today are two industry experts from LegitScript, Scott Roth, who is a CEO, and Gerard Olson, who is the Director of Research. Scott, Gerard, thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you for having us. We're excited to be a part of the conversation and really appreciate you opening up for getting a lot of voices so we can all learn together.
Yeah, same. Excited to be here.
Yeah, definitely. This is a hot topic, so I appreciate both of you being on this episode. So let's just go ahead and start with understanding the GLP-1 boom, and we'll just start with some context. GLP-1 medications have seen a dramatic rise in demand, particularly for weight management. For example, between 2022 and 2023, prescriptions for GLP-1 drugs more than doubled rates, and as a result, bariatric surgery fell by 26%. Now, Scott, these drugs have been around for diabetes management for a while now. So what's driving this recent surge in popularity?
First of all, I like to start pretty much every conversation with sharing our company's mission, which is to make the internet and payment ecosystem safer and more transparent. And I think that's just helpful context because it really shapes everything that we do and how Gerard and myself and the whole team here at LegitScript thinks about things. Thinking specifically about what's going on in this market right now, from my perspective, I feel like there's a couple of things that came together at once. One is in 2021, that's when we started to see semaglutides get approval and start to really increase some of the performance and some of the metrics that were coming from weight loss. I think that also really coincided with obesity being treated more as a chronic disease versus a lifestyle choice. And I think that was something that really has come into more of the mainstream today. It's not quite there, but I think the combination of those two things really has opened up availability and access for so many people to be able to get these medications and drugs for their journey. And depending on the metrics that you trust or believe, thinking about obesity, at least in America, it's up to 50% or maybe even more of the population that are now eligible for these medications for something that they've been struggling with for quite some time. And because of that, we still see so much potential for this market and for people to be served by the medications that are available.
That's a good point. I do want to mention to our listeners, it wasn't only until I think 2013 that the American Medical Association had listed obesity as a chronic disease. So yeah, about 10 years later, here we are seeing these drugs in action, specifically for weight loss. So it's kind of cool. All right, so let's go ahead and look through a broader lens. Gerard, data shows that telehealth demand reached near record levels in 2024, with a significant portion related to GLP-1 prescriptions. Does LegitScript's data also show the same trend? And if so, how has telemedicine contributed to this growth?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. I feel like we have actually a really good insight into this. One of the things that LegitScript does is we have a certification program for online pharmacies and telehealth providers where we basically look at their practices and make sure they're compliant so that consumers and our business partners can feel confident using them. So just in our certification applications alone, we've seen a real massive surge of telehealth companies applying to become LegitScript certified. Just in the first 6 months of this year, we received pretty much the same amount of new applications than we received in all of 2023. More than 60% of those that have applied, those are businesses that focus on weight loss medication, and 98% of those are offering GLP-1 drugs. What we really see here is part of what's driving this trend is there was a real maturation of telemedicine market during COVID. There started being these large developed networks of telehealth providers and businesses, and providers were also becoming a lot more comfortable with the idea of providing telehealth. And then at the same time, there was loosening of a lot of telehealth regulations to accommodate all the COVID restrictions that were in place so that people can still access healthcare. And this also just led to a lot more consumer confidence in using telehealth as a way to get different healthcare. So it basically helped create an almost entirely new customer base and a new industry, really, which it's been both for good and bad. It has really increased patient access. It's increased attention to potential health signifiers. People seem much more likely to actually access healthcare when they feel like there might be a problem. But there's also the potential for lax standards. There's a real lack of substantive enforcement around telehealth just because it's so new. And I think a lot of the regulators don't have the ability to pursue significant action. And there's just a much higher possibility of overprescription or patient fraud as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to go ahead and pivot and talk about the regulatory milestones that occurred in October. I think that's really important to mention. October was a very pivotal month for GLP-1 regulations, as you both know. So, Gerard, let's walk through the timeline real quick. On October 2nd, the FDA removed tirzepatide from the drug shortage list once Eli Lilly stated that they could meet the current and future demands at that moment. And then by mid-month, a lawsuit led by the Outsourcing Facilities Association prompted agencies to allow limited compounding. Can you elaborate a little bit more on these events, their implications, and kind of like where we are today with that shortage?
Yeah, absolutely. For the moment, it really means we're back to the status quo of the last few years. To give a little bit of context, compounding pharmacies, I'm sure people are pretty familiar with them now, but they're basically just pharmacies that they're allowed to manufacture certain drug products without obtaining any sort of FDA approval. In general, it's supposed to be produced for an individual patient based on a prescription by a doctor. And it's basically the theory there, or the idea behind them, is that compounding pharmacies are supposed to be able to ensure patient access to drugs in situations where that access would otherwise be jeopardized. Even though the products don't require FDA approval, they're generally limited to specific patients and specific situations. And one of those situations where they're allowed is when there is a shortage, like we have with tirzepatide, like we have with semaglutide. So this has really been like the nature of the market since 2022, I believe. There's just a huge amount of GLP-1 products on the market that are now compounded drugs because the manufacturers of the FDA-approved drugs have not been able to meet the supply. When the FDA declared the shortage to be resolved, basically what this would have meant was that tirzepatide could no longer be compounded, at least not in the form that it's been compounded, where it's basically a copy of the FDA-approved drug. So now that they've basically pulled back on that a little bit and they're reevaluating it, people can continue to manufacture this, continue to compound them until the FDA moves forward and decides whether the shortage actually is over or whether they pull back and say, no, there still is a continuing shortage. This doesn't mean that they can't still take action if there's other concerns. There are health concerns with certain compounded products. They can still take action there. They're just saying that they will not take action solely for compounding the drug using tirzepatide.
Exactly. And also I want to add, I just read literally right before we started this episode that the FDA won't go after these compounders at least until December 19th or until if they decide earlier. So I guess these compounders can freely compound until the 19th. Until then, I guess we don't know, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and continue on this track of safety and transparency. We know that safety and transparency are critical aspects when purchasing GLP-1 online. A recent LegitScript report found an alarming 1,200% increase in violative GLP-1 ads online. Scott, can you explain more in depth what these ads are and what's driving the surge in the problematic advertising?
For sure. Another part of our business, Gerard mentioned our certification part. We also have a monitoring portion of our business where we work with search engines, social media networks, e-commerce marketplaces to really help them flag any risky or problematic or violative advertisements or product sales that might be happening on their platform. And as a part of this, typically what we'll see is either what we would consider maybe a good actor, someone who is a legitimate provider that maybe is doing things that they shouldn't be doing. It might be things like misleading claims, or it may be they're advertising in a certain jurisdiction or geography where they're not approved to be able to do that and provide those medications. The flip side of that is actually just bad actors who are looking to run a scam or take advantage of consumers by selling, maybe it's counterfeit products, or maybe completely just a non-delivery scam where you think you're going to actually be receiving something, but you don't actually get anything once you go through with the ultimate purchase. As a result of this, we're seeing things on both sides of that equation. And so we are constantly out there monitoring, trying to help with this. And I think on the good actor side, a lot of these companies who have more of this direct to consumer model, maybe it's an online pharmacy or maybe it's a telehealth provider, they aren't used to what's permissible when it comes to actually advertising in these areas. And so it's still a new and evolving field. They maybe are doing something that they shouldn't be doing. And then hopefully in those cases, they'll get notice and they'll correct what they're doing, make sure that they are doing things in line with the regulatory guidelines or the terms of service of the platforms that they're advertising on. And then unfortunately, to the bad actor side, just because this is such a huge market potential with there's so many people who are out there looking for these weight loss drugs and medications, unfortunately, that's just what we see is whenever there's a large population of folks who could be targeted, that's when the bad actors tend to come out of the woodwork and start to go try to make a dollar by taking advantage of consumers who, unfortunately, in this case, really could benefit from some of what they're looking for online.
It's really unfortunate. I wrote an article back in early September that covered a study on the dangers of purchasing semaglutide from unregulated online sources. And the study found that of the 6 that were ordered, 3 were part of the non-delivery schemes that you were talking about. They were paid for, never delivered. So that's half out right there. And then the other 3 had major issues, right? They had labeling discrepancies, they had inaccurate dosing, and contamination. And this is especially for inaccurate dosing. It's huge because I think one of those, it contained like up to 39% more active ingredient than what it had originally stated, which could heighten the risk of overdose. This is especially important because U.S. poison centers have documented a 1,500% increase in semaglutide-related calls. So many linked to overdoses from these exact types of products that we are talking about. And it's clear that safe weight management requires medical oversight and stricter regulation that you're saying that these companies aren't necessarily used to. So, Gerard, what does stronger regulation really look like for this online market? And how can we increase consumer confidence?
I think one thing we have to look at here is we've been talking a lot about the compounding pharmacies, but there's really other avenues here for illicit GLP-1 sales. A lot of these pharmacies, they're not really pharmacies. They are basically unapproved drug sellers. They're not compounding pharmacies. And this is like a trend that we've seen basically throughout the history of LegitScript, and what we've really been chasing is these large rogue pharmacy networks that they find a drug trend and they jump on it and they start selling counterfeit or unapproved versions of these drugs to consumers without requiring a prescription, without holding any sort of licensure. And that's really what the main danger really is behind those rogue pharmacies. There's also concerns, obviously, with compounding pharmacies, but most of the danger and most of the concern is really coming from these rogue pharmacies that have no sort of requirements at all, that are not following any sort of regulations. So what better regulations look like is really just more enforcement of the current regulations. We have the laws on the books. It's not really a case of folks operating inside the law and the law is not doing a good enough job to make sure they're safe. It's really more that people are operating outside of the law. These are clearly illegal websites. So one thing that really helps is just better consumer education. So making sure consumers know, what does a legitimate online seller look like? What are the signals that they need to look at to make sure they can feel confident that the drugs that they are getting are safe? And like you said, there's really a wide range of potential problems that can arise from these drugs. There's the quality issues, there's the unsafe ingredients, dosing issues too. This is an issue with both compounding pharmacies and the unapproved rogue pharmacies. Consumers are not being properly informed how much they're supposed to dose themselves, since they're usually not coming in the pre-filled injection pens that the approved forms are coming. And then even with compounding pharmacies or telehealth, there can be really lax prescribing standards where maybe people might not be eligible for the drug, but There's not a clear following the standards that you would meet in an in-person consultation. And then you also have issues with counterfeits where, a lot of these rogue pharmacies are creating counterfeit versions, selling them as the approved versions, and they do not meet the standards and can be contaminated. So I think there's a really wide range of issues here, but really what it comes down to is we just need better consumer education and better enforcement of the existing regulations.
Yeah, and something I guess like I can't move on from is the ads, right? The problematic ads. Gerard, LegitScript data shows that 83% of problematic GLP-1 ads involve jurisdictional violations, while others fail to meet prescription requirements. Can you explain what this means in detail and how these violations actually impact the consumer trust and just the overall market?
Yeah, absolutely. When we look at it, basically we consider jurisdictional violations. It can mean a wide range of things, but basically we consider that to be a violation of the law in the specific jurisdiction where it's operating. The main thing we see there is advertising to consumers in jurisdictions where that's not allowed. In the US, we're very different from most other countries in the world where manufacturers can have direct-to-consumer advertising for pharmaceutical drugs. That's not the case in most other countries. So what we see a lot of times is advertising of these prescription-only drugs to consumers online. Those are the jurisdictional violations that we're most likely to see. And I think that really highlights part of the issue here in the US, as we see in the compounding pharmacy and advertising there is, while there's restrictions on how manufacturers can advertise to consumers, there's not really any prohibition on advertising or the language that compounding pharmacies can use when they're advertising to consumers. So a lot of products are often marketed in a misleading manner. The FDA will sometimes go after this sort of advertising, but it's very limited. And it really comes down to, are they promoting it as being better or equal to the FDA approved drug? But we see a lot of other claims and advertising that kind of falls outside of the scope of that. So that's one thing that we really are looking at from the advertising side at LegitScript. And then the prescription requirement for the ads that we see, that's just products that are clearly being sold without any sort of prescription. That's the real violations that we're most concerned about, but they're much, much fewer and far between than the jurisdictional violations.
Got you. Thank you. That was a really good explanation. Scott, we had mentioned in our conversation before about, I think we mentioned the merchant certification applications. There had been a surge in healthcare merchant certification applications this year, many tied to GLP-1 medications. Can you explain to our audience what these are and what does this signal about the market?
Sure. So just starting around what LegitScript certification is. So we have what is really an industry recognized certification program that consists of a really rigorous vetting process, but also ongoing monitoring of companies that are providing goods and services from a healthcare and health and wellness perspective. It could be if you're an operator of an online pharmacy, if you are running a telehealth platform or facility, if you are a pharmaceutical manufacturer. We even have a certification for addiction treatment centers. And so what our certification consists of, and all this information is fully available on our website, but the standards fall in three different categories. The first is registration and compliance. So that's really checking, is this business who they say they are? Do they have the proper licensure and registration for their company in place? The second part is around internal practices. What practices are you going through as far as the medications that you are either providing, or what are the different established standards? Are you playing by the rules when it comes to the different providers or the networks that you're connected with on that side? So it's really more about their business practices and making sure that they're doing things in an above board manner. And then the last part is really their external practices. How are they engaging with the outside public? This covers a lot of different things, and even all the way down into, are they making claims that are appropriate for the business type that they're operating, the things that they're providing as a part of their business? And it's something where we work with the folks who are in this space to vet their business, and then we monitor them on an ongoing basis to make sure that they continue to adhere to the certification standards that we've put forward. What that then gives them is really the LegitScript seal of approval that they can put on their website, and it can really help to build consumer confidence and make sure that when consumers do go to their website, they know that they're LegitScript certified. They can come to LegitScript, they can search for certified providers as a part of it as well, and know that they have gone through those standards, that they're being continuously monitored against those standards, and hopefully have more confidence in the providers that they're working with. And so what I think that means for the market is, again, this is a big growing space. We continue to see more and more people coming to us to get this certification so they can build up that confidence, so that they have the ability to go advertise and grow their business. And to me, it's really encouraging because it also means that people are wanting to do things the right way, wanting to build that up and be able to make sure that they're putting their best foot forward in how they're operating their business. I'll weigh in from my perspective. I think that we're still in the early innings of this. And I think for me, it really just comes down to math. Again, in the US, there's estimates that 50% of the population is struggling with chronic obesity. And this is something where you then apply that to other countries across the globe. The numbers may vary a little bit, but there are so many people out there that can be served through proper medications around weight loss. And when you look at the number of people who are taking these medications now, it's still so small compared to the overall amount that could be benefiting from these. And that's what leads me to believe that we're still in the early days of this. And again, that's one of the reasons why I'm really grateful for your podcast, is that we're all learning as this goes and as this evolves. And I think the more voices we can have at the table as we see continued shifts and changes and adjustments in the market, the better it will be for health overall and for consumers and their wellness.
Well, as we move forward, I'll throw this question either to Scott or Gerard, whoever wants to take it, or if you both want to comment, please do so. As we move forward, do you think that GLP-1 demand will continue to grow, or are we finally reaching a plateau?
I'll weigh in from my perspective. I think that we're still kind of in the early innings of this. And I think for me, it really just kind of comes down to math. Again, in the US, there's estimates that 50% of the population is struggling with chronic obesity. And so this is something where you then apply that to other countries across the globe. The numbers may vary a little bit, but there are so many people out there that can be served through proper medications around weight loss. And so when you look at the number of people who are taking these medications now, it's still so small compared to the overall amount that could be benefiting from these. And so that's what leads me to believe that we're still kind of in the early days of this. And again, that's one of the reasons why I'm really grateful for your podcast, is that, we're all learning as this goes and as this evolves. And I think the more, voices we can have at the table as we see continued shifts and changes and adjustments in the market, the better it will be for health overall and for consumers and their wellness.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Gerard, for sharing your insights into this GLP-1 boom.
Thanks for having us.
And thank you, listener, for tuning in. If you liked what you heard, head over to Spotify or Apple and drop us a review. We will be choosing some of our reviews to be read on the show in appreciation, so keep listening through to the end because you might get name dropped. See you next time. Music by Vice President of Editorial Kyle Murphy, and production by me, Kelsey Waddell.
This is a Tech Target production.